Nyt toivotan, että päästään aloittamaan ja please David, this stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for coming in. Such a beautiful day. You've actually come inside. Hard to believe. And this is the one presentation I'm doing here where I'm not playing any music. This is the one with pictures and thoughts. I'll be back on the same stage playing at 5 p.m. with the Buster Keaton film. And Teho. And just the two of us, right? Anyone else? Where is he?
Teho is there somewhere.
Yeah, just the two of us. Yeah, and all kinds of sounds. And but this right now I'm talking about a book that I wrote a few years ago called Survival of the Beautiful, which is about the issue of why is there so much beauty in evolution, in nature. And this is the beauty that first inspired me in terms of sounds and music of birds and insects and whales. Why is it all so beautiful if it's supposed to be all so practical? And it turned out that, of course I'm not the only one to worry about this. In fact, Charles Darwin is famous for saying the peacock's tail, something that really made him sick. He wrote in a letter to the fellow biologist Asa Gray. He said, the peacock's tail really makes me sick because it was very hard to explain by the theory of natural selection, which is that organisms would evolve over the many generations traits that were useful for survival. That's where the phrase survival of the fittest comes from. But this is ridiculous. How could an animal evolve something so insane and have to carry it around all the time on display? And of course, the more you learn about peacocks, the more ridiculous it even is. Most peacocks never even get to mate. Only a few of them do. Most of them just have to carry around all this beauty, as a kind of baggage, as a kind of weight. And so this really perplexed Darwin. He really started to think there must be more to evolution than survival of the fittest. There must be some way to explain all this beauty. We have this whole group of birds called birds of paradise, mostly coming from New Guinea, some in Australia. People, explorers brought back these creatures, and people said, you must have been to paradise to find such weird things. And, well, that was the blue bird of paradise. This is the red bird of paradise. They just got all this crazy stuff that has evolved for some reason. And this is the reason is what led Darwin to develop a whole different theory, another part of evolution. Not just natural selection, survival of the fittest, but survival of the beautiful, sexual selection. That organisms would develop extreme traits just because they are beautiful, just because it was attractive. Mostly it's males in different species that do this, but not entirely. The males have these outlandish displays and feathers and coloration, and that females then get to choose, which means, of course, that the entire idea of beauty is only in the brains of female birds. They're the ones who care about this stuff, or else it wouldn't evolve to such extreme nature. Nothing this bird has is particularly useful. Strange little curved, tiny feathers, this sitting upside down, not very useful. Just crazy colors and this kind of sense of extreme. Usually, sexual selection is tempered by practicalities of life. So, for example, you can have a goldfinch that has some colors here, or a sparrow that just has this red patch right here. That's enough. Enough of the beautiful, and the rest is practical, small and brown, and can fly away fast. But sometimes it goes to incredible extremes, not just like tales of peacocks and birds of paradise, but this, for example. I first came across something like this in Australia. I just thought it was a pile of blue plastic garbage in the woods. But actually, this is an artwork made by the satin bowerbird. Anybody seen these? So this is a work of art made by birds, and the satin bowerbird has evolved the need to collect blue stuff and decorate it around this little sculpture that he makes to attract female satin bowerbirds. And this is quite remarkable because you notice he's mostly collected blue plastic bottle tops and straws. So how could a bird have evolved the need to collect these things that didn't exist when this evolution happened? Presumably they used to collect blue flowers and I don't know what else is blue, just blue flower petals, and now there's just more blue plastic around, so it's much more efficient to grab this stuff. But it's a lot of work just collecting it from piles of garbage or, the streets. And what this shows is not only are there animals that have evolved, beautiful performances like songs and feathers and coloration, but they actually have developed in rare cases, maybe only among bowerbirds, the need to actually make artworks. There he is, a satin bowerbird. He's a little bit bluish-black himself. So some scientists have said, well, all this collection of blue stuff is somehow intensify his own character so that he seems more blue if he's surrounded by blue, which is an interesting idea. And the female, this structure is a little bit practical, and the female, it's like a little seat. She can sit there and observe him, and then he picks up all the stuff, throws it around, sings and dances. There's a whole kind of postmodern show. It's very strange. And maybe, if she's happy, maybe they get to mate. Usually not, because usually it's not good enough. And in the literature, this interest led me to read lots of scientific papers on these things. And the literature traditionally would say that the bowerbird with the most blue stuff, the loudest song, the biggest display, and more, was the best one and would get the most chances to mate. There was very little evidence of this, but it was just written. It was assumed, all written by male scientists. And some of them would write that the older the bird, the more successful he is. These are usually the older male scientists who wrote that kind of stuff. And then there was one woman who was studying in the lab in Maryland with Gerald Borgia, who's the major bowerbird scientist. She said, this probably isn't true, you're just like saying it so. And he said, well, how could you test your theory that anything's different? It was, I'll just design a robot female bowerbird, a fembot bowerbird, which you see here with this control panel. And she had this idea that, in fact, the female was more discerning and liked a balance of not too loud, not too soft, not too much throwing stuff around. And once it got too extreme, she would leave, just go. And so she demonstrated with this study that, she concluded that, in fact, her hypothesis was correct. Things couldn't be too extreme. In fact, she could control very carefully male behavior by making the bird flinch a little bit, and then the male would get a little quieter and stop doing things. So this is a whole sort of study. And what's interesting is this kind of stuff is rarely studied. The idea of beauty and evolution is not a big topic in science. And later we'll say why that is, because it seems so interesting to me. And to many people, why is it not studied so extensively? But nevertheless, the satin bowerbird is one of many species. Each one has its own way of doing things. This is Vogelkopf's bowerbird, actually built this huge thing. So this giant arrangement here is built by another bird, another kind of bowerbird. So he builds this kind of tent-like structure, and he decorates things very vastly with different colors of little fruits and berries and things. This is from New Guinea. And this looks even more like a weird artwork you'd see in a museum these days. In Kiasma or the Whitney Museum, an installation made by humans. And here's another example. And of course, just like human artists, these bowerbird artists steal from each other. One's going to come and say, no, I'm taking all of your stuff, and flies away with it. And they also spend, months building these things. So one idea is that the reason this isn't more common is there's predators in most places. And if a bird was spending all his time working on a sculpture, and some hawk would come pick him off and take him away, knows exactly where he is. But they still do it. And this is tremendously important, I think, for those of us who believe art must be necessary in life somehow. There's some reason for these things that seem impractical. Which is that people are spending a lot of time making art, and we often argue you should spend more money supporting art, and people will say it's not practical, it's not useful. And yet in evolution, in nature, here's like 9 different species of bowerbirds that each evolve their own aesthetic sense. They have to build these things. And there is no practical reason why one species needs to build something that looks like a Christmas tree, in the case of McGregor's bowerbird, or golden bowerbird, something that looks like the giant skyscraper in Malaysia, the Petronas Towers with a bridge across it. Why did they evolve and need to build these things? There's no real reason each species needs these specific things. It's just because the females liked it. It's just for aesthetic preference that is valuable in its own sake. That being said, this is in a way the minority view in science. Many scientists will say all these things are very practical and there's an explanation for everything, and one day we're going to find it, we just don't know it yet. Here's another picture showing the evolutionary relationships between how one species went in this direction, one went here, one went there. But does it have to be, do we only understand it when we can explain exactly why an animal is doing this as opposed to that? Is that what it means to understand it? I'm not sure. Oh, which one is this? Not satin bowerbird. I think spotted bowerbird, yes. He collects white stuff instead of blue. And why? Does he need, I had a long argument at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington with Jerry Borgia, the bowerbird expert, and I said this is all just aesthetic preference, no particular reason. He goes, that's ridiculous, you're anti-science. I said, I'm not anti-science, I just think sometimes science doesn't ask the most interesting questions, like why is there beauty in evolution? Not what's the purpose of beauty in evolution. We know that you could look at sexual selection and say the purpose of all this is to facilitate mating. It's all for the purpose of furthering the species along. That might be what it's for, but that's not what it is. What it is animals evolving the need to make art. They have to do this, and they could just as easily not have gone in this direction. If you wound back evolution hundreds of millions of years, you're not going to get these same things happening again. Something else will happen. Now this isn't made by a bowerbird at all. This is a sculpture made by a human. Patrick Doherty travels the world building things like this. And these artworks, he builds them. They take him months, several months, like bowerbirds, and they stay up for a while. Some last for years, some fall apart. And he certainly knew about bowerbirds when he started this artistic practice, but he's an example of another side to the story, that once humans start making artworks like this and say, this is a work of art, then you have to look at the bowerbird structures differently, because we've come to accept structures as creative, aesthetic, valuable things that maybe in previous generations wouldn't have been so appreciated. And so then we have to take the presence of beauty and artistry in nature more seriously. And I think this is a very under-investigated idea. That's something that's a big theme of this book, is how the widening sense, changing human aesthetic, what is beautiful, leads us to take beauty in nature seriously in different ways. And so then you come across the peacock's tail. You see every generation, every century is going to see this differently, because we have a different sense of what is beautiful, and what is necessary, and what is practical. And as I mentioned, I got interested in this first from comparing not visual things, but sound. I was very perplexed by the fact that nightingale songs and whale songs were so alike. And yet these animals are not related to each other. So I was going to save this to the end, but I'll play it now, an example of what I'm talking about. Here, this is from, I saw an art exhibit where an artist was interested in the same things. He imagined some half whale bird creature. It had to be something like this to explain why the songs are so similar. So this is a sonogram, a printout of the song, which is the way scientists study sound. They need to see it to draw conclusions about it, because otherwise it goes by too fast. So here you start with the whale, like you heard last night in my concert. That's a humpback whale singing at its usual speed. And that's also the whale at its regular speed. He also gets high. And now it's sped up. Now it's faster. You see that it's very structured. It's not random at all. It's very organized. Contrasts of sound, repeating patterns. Okay, here's a thrush nightingale, kind of nightingales you have in Finland. You turn it down a little bit. Here's the slowed down nightingale. It's not that it sounds exactly like the whale, but the way it's structured, the level of complexity and difference is related. And there's the whale played against the slowed down nightingale. So what this is showing is, the idea is that these are both extreme examples of evolution. Whoops. That it's not, both of these animals have very extreme performances. Nightingales sing all night, repeating it, up to 150 different phrases in different patterns, one after another. Humpback whales can sing for 24 hours, also singing a whole series of different patterns in a very organized way. No other related species to these animals do anything like that. There's very few birds that sing that extensively and complexly. There's no other whale species that needs to sing a long song. So in these species, they're once again examples, like the bowerbirds were examples of animals that needed to evolve to make, the need to make art. These species somehow evolved the need for extensive, long performances that are kind of beautiful. And they relate to each other. The animals are totally unrelated, but the way these songs are structured is somehow related. And this is what fascinated me, what holds together the evolution of beauty in nature. And, previously I talked about how, it's sort of arbitrary what is chosen. That's something that Darwin talked about. Sexual selection is arbitrary. Doesn't mean anything that this bowerbird likes blue, this one likes white. A hornbill has a giant horn on its head. It's totally useless. It's difficult to deal with. Turkeys have red things dangling. These are, it could have been anything that somehow was preferred over the generations. Anything could be preferred. That's one way in which there's beauty in nature, just preference that is established in a species over time. But the other way is something that became added to the story of evolution through the work of Ernst Haeckel, German biologist and artist, is that there's certain patterns in nature that are basic and necessary, and because they're the ones that are possible. And these forms and designs are found at all levels of the natural world. And Haeckel was a teenager when he wrote to Charles Darwin and sent some of his illustrations. He says, "Your theories will change the world, and I'm going to make you famous on the continent in Germany, and because I'm going to illustrate what you're talking about, that all forms in nature are connected, they've evolved." And he did that. He did scientific research that specialized on the beauty and diversity of nature. And this thing that looks a lot like a geodesic dome, something that we associate with Buckminster Fuller, the scientist and engineer, a whole 60, 70 years later, is actually a microscopic sea creature called a radiolarian, and Haeckel would collect these things. They'd come back from expeditions to the Arctic. They'd give him all these little creatures he collected. They're like this big, and then he would study them under the microscope and draw them and show their beauty and symmetry. Shells and patterns. He was trying to illustrate how all this stuff was there in the natural world. He said his most famous book outside of science is called Art Forms in Nature, which is like a popular coffee table book since the 1880s. It's always been loved by artists and designers. And these are all tiny Arctic sea creatures, radiolarians. And if you look at photographs of these things, they never look as good as Haeckel's illustrations of them. And he's just was obsessed with the beauty and symmetry of different things that had evolved. And this kind of evolution, this is on the left, more radiolaria, on the right, sort of seaweed and jellyfish arranged in these patterned ways. So whether he's an accurate scientific illustrator or someone who took ideas of symmetry in nature and kind of unfolded his own aesthetic from them can be a little unclear. On the left is from a science book of his, and the right is from an art book. And the illustrations are similar but a little bit different. But the fact is, these kinds of things he's talking about have not evolved through sexual selection. It's not the preference of anyone that led these things to happen rather than others, but rather the physics and laws of physics and chemistry that make certain forms possible. Nobody is deciding that these things evolved rather than any others. These are just all the possible shapes. And this is another way of trying to find out what beauty is natural as opposed to something artificial. What are the forms that nature has as opposed to things that it doesn't have? Haeckel had a lot of influence on art and design at the beginning of the 20th century. These books were very popular. They were full of, they were considered like radical ideas about getting back to nature through futuristic thinking. And this is the Paris Exposition of 1903. This is by René Binet. It's very specifically based on this. In Haeckel's book, he said, I'm going to build something, it's going to be totally futuristic and cool, and it all comes from nature. And I imagine this is the equivalent of today's buildings like those designed by Frank Gehry with weird curves and shapes that we say now are somehow based on pure form and nature in a new way. This is like, even though we look at this now, it looks sort of classical and old, and you see the Eiffel Tower in the background. And this is like, but I think to understand this, you have to look at it as if it was futuristic. Like this is showing we're now getting back to nature in our futuristic thinking. We always want to get back to nature and make it new rather than old. Later on, Haeckel's artworks got more and more trippy and strange. This is like, I guess it's tentacles of an octopus, but it's not any real octopus. It's just octopus spread around and around. This started influencing surrealists, who liked the more gooey side of Haeckel. This is from Max Ernst. And all these are all artists who specifically said that Haeckel influenced them. This guy, I forget his name, was the kind of Art Nouveau designer of these swirly shapes. This was in Belgium, I think. And this was all like seen as these ideas from nature entering human aesthetic thought. Giacomo Balla, this painting of sun and moon, trying to connect it to these forms and symmetry of the natural world. And this is a 3D printer example of some fractal mathematics made a few years ago. Again, in the spirit of Ernst Haeckel, who would no doubt be churning these things out by the millions today if he was around. And the idea is certain senses of symmetry that are exact but not quite exact, spread throughout the natural world, which makes these things form, because this is what mathematics, chemistry, and physics makes possible. Other things are not possible. So that's another way of looking at the peacock's tail. Look at all these feathers and the symmetry and the sameness and yet the diversity of it. This is something that nature is able to make, some things it would be unable to make. And you find that in scientific imagery at very different scales. This is like a thin sliver of some kind of fruit this is microscopic things, like one-celled organisms. They show a certain sense where you can imagine like this is natural as opposed to something else is not, and that there's certain senses of pattern and form that are there. It's another part of beauty in nature that's not necessarily evolved through preference. And this is an idea that captivated the biologist Richard Prum, who's professor of ornithology and ecology at Yale University, who is one of the few biologists working today who think beauty should be studied more closely. And he figured out how patterns on feathers evolved in the first place. And he found that, these patterns evolve not, some things are possible and some are impossible. He used some mathematics developed by Alan Turing, famous for inventing computer science, about how one cell could be dark, the other could be light, what patterns happen, what's the likelihood that things are the same or different. I'm happy to say he says that he doesn't really understand the mathematics either, but he's got people to help him, and he was able to figure out these are the 9 possible basic feather patterns that exist in nature. All feathers fit into these 9 different patterns, based on what's possible according to activation, inhibition, mathematics, and what's not. And these are examples of them. And through this kind of mathematics and understanding what information in DNA makes feather development possible, Prum is most known for being the first person to figure out exactly what colors a dinosaur really looked like. This dinosaur, like many, has feathers. They're literally like pre-bird creatures. And although we've seen many colored dinosaurs in the past, they've all been made up. And now there's other people who have sequenced the correct colors of feathered dinosaurs. And this is the Ralph Steadman version, which is kind of nice. The feathered dinosaur. Now, interestingly, one of Richard Prum's latest graduate students came to study biology. His last job was designing creatures in New Zealand for Lord of the Rings movies. And now he thought he'd go become a biologist and study feathers after doing that, because he had had such training with figuring out what seems possible and likely and what's unlikely. But the other thing that's interesting is Richard Prum is one biologist who thinks that the history of art and aesthetics is necessary to understand how biology works. And he's very impressed by this famous artwork by Marcel Duchamp called Fountain, which is just like ripped out of a men's bathroom and stuck on its side, and in an art exhibit in the Armory Show in 1913 in New York. They said, "We'll accept any artwork." And he said, "Oh yeah? Well, let's see if you accept this." And so he put it in there, and it became this big scandal that said, "How can you just stick that in the show? You didn't do enough. You just put it sideways and you signed it R. Mutt. Is that enough to make an artwork?" And